everyone. My name is Evie Lupine and welcome back to another Marilyn Manson update. I did want to do another update sometime soon. I had a totally different video planned, but there has been some really big breaking news in the last couple of days about Marilyn Manson. Namely, that there was a brand new lawsuit filed in the state of New York, as opposed to California, where all of the other lawsuits are currently taking place. And this one is really big, not just because it is in a new state, but also because the allegations are things we haven't necessarily seen before. Namely, the plaintiff alleges that what happened to her with Marilyn Manson began when she was only 16 years old and a minor, which is obviously some really big and heavy news. This is going to be a heavy video to get through, and just know what's going to happen today. It is necessary to some extent. We're going to be talking about the lawsuit itself, articles about it. We're going to be going over past things that Marilyn Manson has said that relate to this lawsuit, and also some past statements from former fans and people who have spoken out in ways that relate to this particular case. It'll all make sense as we go along. So let's go ahead and talk about this lawsuit with an article that was published right away as soon as this lawsuit got filed, basically, that was written by the Rolling Stone. Marilyn Manson allegedly groomed and sexually assaulted an underage girl multiple times in the 1990s, according to a new lawsuit. This is the first suit to focus on sex crimes that allegedly took place in the beginning of Manson's career, while those who have previously sued the singer all accused him of sexual misconduct around 2010. The plaintiff, now an adult, has submitted the suit anonymously as Jane Doe. The filing includes counts of sexual battery and intentional infliction of emotional distress against Warner, and negligence, among other charges against the labels. In the lawsuit, Doe says she first encountered Warner in 1995 after a Dallas concert when she was age 16. She had waited outside his tour bus with a group of people to meet him, and he allegedly invited her and one of the other younger girls onto his bus, where he asked their age and school grade and took down their home addresses and phone numbers. While on the tour bus, defendant Warner performed various acts of criminal sexual conduct upon plaintiff, who was a virgin at the time, including but not limited to forced copulation and vaginal penetration, the lawsuit claims. The age of consent in Texas at the time was, and still is, 17. Then defendant Warner demanded plaintiff to get the fuck off my bus and threatened plaintiff that, if she told anyone, he would kill her and her family. In the lawsuit, the Jane Doe then goes on to allege that she began to use drugs and alcohol in order to cope with the assault, that Marilyn Manson continued to be nice to her and would do things like say good things about her artwork, and was generally trying to groom her, such that she agreed to see him again one more time when she was still a minor. Now, a few years later, in '99, when she was dating the drummer for 9 Inch Nails, Vrenna, she did run into Manson again and ended up spending 4 weeks with him while on tour. During this period, the suit alleges that Warner began tightening his psychological control over Doe. Defendant Warner often made plaintiff feel alone and isolated by telling her that no one understands her other than him, which included her family. Defendant Warner often coerced plaintiff to have sex with him and other band members or his assistant at the same time. Defendant Warner controlled what plaintiff could do, who could touch plaintiff, and who he wanted plaintiff to be with sexually, all while providing plaintiff with drugs. Defendant Warner openly called her racial slurs and called her fat. And in response to these allegations, Marilyn Manson's legal team had this to say, quote, Warner's attorney, Howard King, says Warner does not know this individual and has no recollection of ever having met her 28 years ago. He certainly was never intimate with her. He went on to call Doe's allegations a fabricated tale and added that even the most minimal amount of scrutiny reveals the obvious discrepancies in her ever-shifting stories, as well as her extensive collusion with other false accusers. Brian will not submit to this shakedown, and the courts won't fall for it either. But this lawsuit isn't just about Marilyn Manson. Labels he was associated with at the time are also being sued. At no time did defendant Interscope and defendant Nothing Records have a reasonable system or procedure in place to investigate, supervise, or monitor its staff and or agents, including defendant Warner, to prevent pre-sexual grooming and sexual harassment, molestation, and assault of fans, including minors and women. With the lawsuit adding that the labels were well aware of his fascination with CSEM and pedophilia, but continued to book him for all ages shows. Now, I will be honest, there are some elements of this lawsuit that do seem a little bit of a reach reach to me. Like, there are some points they make in that there are symbols on Marilyn Manson posters and even a tattoo that he has that allegedly connect to, like, pedophilia symbology of, like, little boy lovers and little girl lovers. And, you know, I don't know, early Marilyn Manson especially was all about the taboo and the occult and symbology. It could have been a reference, but it also could just be swirlies on a poster. And I'm not really sure which one of the two of those is more likely, but I'm probably leaning towards just like it's more likely to be a random swirly curly Q symbol. I don't know. I'm not an expert. We will let the symbology experts debate that should this ever get to court. But there are some other elements of the lawsuit that Rolling Stone didn't mention that I do think are pretty compelling. For example, there was the use of a hotline number that was allegedly used to coax underage fans into sending nude photos in the mail. This possibility was originally spoken about by a former fan club manager who spoke to Rolling Stone about this back in 2021. Jane Doe also alleges that Manson began to call her home, soliciting her to send sexual photos of herself and her friends to his fan club, and he also began talking to her over an internet chat group. If this ends up being true, that Marilyn Manson was asking his minor fans to send him nudes in the mail, that is a really big deal. And it makes you wonder, what evidence might they have of this, right? This went through the fan club, supposedly, right? So does anyone have records of that? An old shoebox of like 90s Manson fan club Polaroids? I would really like to see maybe what that evidence would look like. We're probably never going to see it because we usually don't, but it does make you wonder. And speaking of things that are making people wonder, this was kind of hinted at in the lawsuit in terms of a response by Howard King. And that would be, these allegations are very similar to ones made previously in 2021 by somebody who had not, to this point, filed anything legally against him. Now, I'm not going to name her name because it is easily out there, but I know she did file this as a Jane Doe, and if they are the same person, I want to respect that. So, there was an individual who in 2021 made very similar, basically identical allegations that in 95 in Dallas, they met up with Marilyn Manson, that he was with her, she was 16, she was a minor. He would call her fat, he would call her very particular racial slurs. And again, they are just very, very similar. Now, the main point of contention that people have about these allegations, if they are the same ones from the same person, is that in the initial article where these allegations came out, the only thing that was alleged was inappropriate groping and kissing, and obviously this person being a minor at the time, which is very bad in its own right, but it is not the same as forced copulation and vaginal penetration, at least not to my knowledge. The definitions for those things would not all be the same. And so, of course, some people are going to say, well, that proves these allegations are false, because if they were true, why isn't the story the same? And that's why she's filing this as a Jane Doe, is to conceal her previous false allegations. And I don't know, okay, we could go to that tinfoil hat land if we want to, but I don't know, right? It could just be that she wasn't prepared to talk about that in a random Sun article. It could be that, you know, she thought about it more and remembered more because this was like over 25 years ago that this happened. There could be other possibilities there, though I understand why it might make some people skeptical. But at the same time, Marilyn Manson himself is not going, okay, well, it was only groping, it wasn't this other stuff, it was only kissing, it wasn't this. Like, he's saying he never met this person at all. So it doesn't really matter what she's alleging happened necessarily too much if he's just going to go back and say, well, I've never met this person, I don't know them, they're just lying about everything, I have no idea who this is. So I really feel like in terms of the court, what is going to play out is probably going to be, do they actually know each other before, okay, was it this, was it that, does this mean this or that? Because this isn't a criminal trial for intentional infliction of emotional distress, which is very different from, like, I don't know, trying to figure out what category of, like, statutory rape somebody falls into. Very different scenarios there. And I also want to address with this as well, some people might say, well, but maybe they lied about their ages. Maybe they had a fake ID. Maybe this, that, and the other. Maybe they said they were 20, but they were really 16. And that is a very common line of logic for people to go down. It is called a mistaken age defense. Mistaken age is not a defense. Marilyn Manson would have had a duty of due diligence, of course, to check these ages. But if she was 16, 15, 14, it doesn't matter if she was actually that age. That is on him as the adult to bear that responsibility. So keep that in mind. And also, just because this happened a lot in the 90s, because it's another defense, right? Is, oh, well, everyone did this. It was a rock star era. You know, everyone had groupies. It was normal. Everyone was proud to be a groupie. It wasn't a bad thing. Stop trying to reframe this as abuse. Everyone knew what was going on. We are obviously learning that this was not always an okay thing to do for everyone. Of course, yes, there are going to be adult groupies that wanted to be groupies, that liked it. That doesn't mean it was okay for a rock star, any rock star, to have a 15, 16, 14-year-old, high schooler go to the back of their bus after a show and have sex with them, to assault them, to have them perform acts for them sexually. Not okay, doesn't matter how normalized it used to be, and I hope this culture is changing because it definitely needs to. And I do want to go back to one other point that the lawsuit talks about, which is that when this Jane Doe would have been 18, 19 years old, she was with a drummer named Chris Vrenna, who actually also spoke about his experience with Marilyn Manson before any public allegations were made in 2018. I don't want to say it was a nightmare, but it was a 3-ring drunken circus on wheels all the time, forever. Quick version of why I quit is it's a very dark lifestyle. There's a lot of substance problems. The hours are insane. It's just really intense. It's as crazy as everything you've ever read and everything you've ever heard. He also discussed seeing some, quote, horrifically bizarre stuff, but declined to go into any further detail. And it does make you wonder, what did he see when he was on tour with him? Was it fans, groupies, something with Jane Doe? Was it backstage, on tour buses? What was so horrible he had to quit working with Marilyn Manson? Could it be just a simple drug and alcohol problem? Sure, but probably not, because he is far from the first ex-bandmate, crew member, or employee to talk about negative experiences with Marilyn Manson. And speaking of that, I do want to talk about Marilyn Manson in his own words, because right now we don't have any filings legally from him on this case. We have that one statement from Howard King, but nothing directly responding to all of the facts alleged in this case. And so, because we don't have that, I think the next best thing we can do is look at Marilyn Manson's previous words to try and get a sense of his mindset, what he was thinking about fans and groupies and sex with minors and all of that as we go through the timeline of him being a rock star. And actually, the quotes I have from Marilyn Manson begin in '95, around the same time the allegations start from this Jane Doe. Quote, "I've always found that the best and most exciting stories on the road are better left a secret because of the statute of limitations. I can say I've never ceased to be amazed at the level of depravity that a male or female will go. I realize that a lot of fans are caught up in the excitement of the moment. So anybody that gets into any exploitation is not someone who doesn't want to get taken advantage of." And that is quite the quote, isn't it? Because he's basically saying, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I'm waiting to talk about it so I can't get in trouble for it. And not only that, but even if I was hurting people, I can't actually be held liable because it's not really harming them, because anyone who is exploited wants to be exploited because they're there because they want to be taken advantage of, which is just not how this works. But you will be surprised to learn that this single quote from 95 and the things that he's probably referring to in it actually come up seemingly multiple times over several decades. So actually, way in the future, in the past for now, in 2012, he also talked about some things that happened in 1995 while on tour. It's pretty tame, at least for me. The combination of always having a girlfriend on tour with me and my aversion to people I don't know touching me. But I've done some things. I've been involved in some activities I'm not proud of. I did get into a precarious situation where it ended up really scary. There was a bus driver for Danzig. They toured together in 95 when we were on tour with them. He would hogtie girls with an apparatus where if you didn't keep your arms back far enough, it would start to choke you. He said to me once, "Manson, I've got this girl tied up. I want you to come in and get her to confess to sins. We'll videotape it." This sounded real good on paper. Well, the whole thing just wasn't as nasty in my imagination. So I walked into the room. We were in Kansas, I think. Note that Danzig did not go to Kansas in 95, but they did go to Kansas City. And I instantly felt bad for this girl because she has psoriasis or something. Plus, she was passed out and we thought she was dead. It kind of nipped in the bud any inclination I had towards groupies. And so it's interesting because 20 plus years later, he's trying to say, oh, like I wasn't into groupies at all. Like it totally got killed for me, man. And maybe that was the case, right? It could have been. But this happened right in the time frame of when these allegations would have taken place. So it could have been this Jane Doe had terrible things happen to them, and then later Manson grew out of it. Should he not be held liable because he's a changed man? I don't think so, but actually there's more quotes about this time period in the mid-90s. While on tour with 9 Inch Nails and Jim Rose in the 90s, note that Jim Rose was only active in 94, so it would have been around then, Marilyn wrote that he and his band members swore to stop exploiting and humiliating girls backstage, indicating they had at some point exploited and humiliated girls backstage, and to instead perform a therapeutic service for them. He said this involved a video camera and some girls willing to confess their deepest, most intimate sins. Marilyn wrote, "She released the pressure on her hands and legs and allowed the contraption to snap tightly around her neck. Her head hit the floor unconscious. I bent down in a daze and began fumbling with the knots and rope, unable to do a thing as her face swelled from red to purple. But she didn't wake up. We slapped her, screamed at her, dumped water on her. Nothing worked. This was bad. I did not want to be the first rock and roller to have actually killed a girl due to backstage hedonism." A similar incident happened again, this time with Tony Wiggins, the bus driver referred to in his 2012 recounting of events. Quote, "When I walked in, he was hogtied with his hands behind his back and an apparatus that forced him to keep his legs spread at a 90-degree angle and his hands behind his back. If he moved any limb from that position, the rope around his neck would tighten and began to choke him. In order to keep him from strangling himself, he had to work to keep himself in this awkward, vulnerable position. Tony stood over him with the video camera, capturing his struggle from every angle." And all I have to say is a BDSMer of going on 8 years now that loves bondage, I would not go within 100 feet of one of these evil contraptions. No, thank you. That sounds like a literal, actual death trap. Now, it could be that it was Tony being a bad influence, and it could be that Manson was totally innocent. It was all Tony's idea. And what I find interesting is that in that quote from an article from 98, he took a lot more authority, seemingly, over what was going on in that scenario. And then later, it sounded more like, oh, Tony did this. I was just there. I just was a participant. Whereas earlier on, he took more authority for what was happening. And so I don't know how much of it was Tony, how much was Manson, if it stopped after 95, it was a one-time thing. But it seems like, based on some more recent quotes, that this fascination with fans in bondage went beyond just a 95 tour. This one, from 2003, while he would have been with Dita Von Teese, says, "Then, of course, there's all that stuff about dragging groupies around on dog leads. Manson says that he doesn't think he has abused female fans. I couldn't victimize people because I am a victim myself in so many ways," he says, adding slightly slyly, "but not everything changes. There's still a great amount of excess in my life. And I have a girlfriend who likes to have interesting times. Manson grins. I can't say I haven't seen her tying up a girl on the bus in bondage ropes. I can't say I haven't seen that. And he said a very similar thing again, also in 2003, just a month later. Quote, I have a sense of respect for people who are part of what I do, and I don't feel the need to disrespectfully abuse them. We had the bus that everybody envied. It became a thing with girls in bondage being forced to do improvisational dances. Well, that's interesting, because that sure sounds like almost 10 years after he supposedly swore off groupies, he was more than happy for his girlfriend to tie up groupies on his tour bus. Interesting line to have there, but okay, it could have literally just been his girlfriend, and then maybe that would be technically him keeping his word about swearing off groupies, but this thing from 2003, that is not even the most famous instance of Marilyn Manson interacting with a groupie sexually. Oh, no. There's one very famous interaction we haven't touched on yet. From an article in 2000, by his own cheerful admission, he has urinated on groupies, snorted cocaine off toilet seats, and spit on strangers. What could that be a reference to? Well, there is a very, very famous situation that happened either in 1993 or 94 involving a deaf girl named Adina, who was either 17 or 18 at the time, depending on the version of events that you read, who said in Demystifying the Devil, an unauthorized documentary about Marilyn Manson, that she was, quote, hesitant over Manson's proposal to have sex. So yeah, it seemed like there is potential for that to not have been as consensual as Marilyn Manson is remembering it to be. Now, even after all of that, even after all those stories from Marilyn Manson himself, there's still one more thing that is worth talking about, because in 2010, Hugh, his father, who has since passed away, said something about his experience with groupies. And we have not really talked about him so far because he's not fully relevant, but there are many rumors that he was quite the sex pest and loved being on tours with his son. Do you have any stories or memorable experiences that you can share from being on the road? Oh, those are bad. I woke up one time and had a bunch of naked groupies on the bus, and I could not partake of them. I love how he talks about partaking of them as though he's partaking of communion wine. Like, what a weird phrase to say about not having sex with probable minors on a tour bus. Like, wow, he really just came out and said that. Now, one more thing that I want to talk about is not just statements from Marilyn Manson himself, but also statements we have seen from over the years about his treatment towards fans. Because I think a lot of people will say, well, this only came out because of the allegations against him, and everyone's saying that he was bad now to get attention, and everyone that knew him like 10 years ago loved it. Look at all these stories of positive fan experiences. You know, when I saw him with my wife, he was perfectly fine, but it seems like there are stories that go back to before any of these allegations were public that indicated that Marilyn Manson may not always have the most positive interactions with fans. I was friends with Manson for a few years, and we first met when I was a teenager at a paid meet and greet, and I was invited backstage after the show. I now recognize certain things as abuse of power and sexual assault. It's not okay for an older man to invite young girls who idolize him onto his bus to take advantage. Or this story that came out in 2021 about something that happened in 2009. Quote, the second or third Marilyn Manson concert I attended. I'm 17, my girlfriend at the time was 16. We're front row, and before the show, Marilyn Manson's crew is walking around the front area between stage and crowd giving out backstage passes. My girlfriend is given one. Looking around the room, it's all women and all young girls. We sit there for 30-ish minutes until Marilyn Manson staff comes in, assess the crowd, and pick out 3 girls. We're all told to keep waiting. 30-ish minutes later, staff returns and grabs 3 more girls after assessing the room again. And then there's this one from 2022. I'll say it loud and clear, knowing exactly what backlash will come. Brian Warner assaulted me at an all-ages show in PDX when I was only 12, and the cops did nothing. He sent his manager out to scout the line, and several minor girls were handed backstage passes while being told he wanted to meet with them. I was immediately put in his lap and the abuse began right away. I refused to detail my abuse to the looky-loos, but I was treated like an inanimate object for over an hour and no one stopped it or did anything to help me. It happened to other girls that were there too. Now, I am not saying that Marilyn Manson is guilty because of something off of a Facebook post. I am not saying that everything that is alleged in all of these things are all 100% the truth. I am not saying any of that. However, if you look at all of these stories, past articles, past statements, you get a picture of at least who Marilyn Manson might have been at some point in time. That he liked getting to play with groupies, young fans, that he may have targeted young fans to invite onto his tour bus, that he liked and engaged in potentially high-risk behavior that even with adults could have gone very wrong. And he seemed to be very vindicated in his treatment towards fans of his. That either they would have been impossible to abuse because they wanted to be abused by him, which is just an incredible statement, or that because they were fans, that it didn't really matter, that they would have wanted that experience with him. And that just does not sit well with me, not in the least. I'm sorry, I know that part of the promise of being a rock star is that you get to fuck around and do whatever to people and have all these crazy times. Well, you don't get to have that without consequences. And for decades, people we know have been abused by the music industry. People have stayed silent. Things have not happened. Things stay the same until and when people speak out and ask for justice. And I hope that justice does end up being served here at some point in time. I have always said that I want things to have their day in court. I want this to be fairly evaluated and for people to get the justice they deserve, no matter what that ends up looking like. But it's hard to ignore when you see stories over the course of decades from Manson, from fans, from ex-lovers, from ex-bandmates, indicating that he likely had a problem with minors and fans for at least a portion of his career. Could it have gone away when he was with Dita and Rose, that he kept that stuff to a minimum if he did it at all? Sure, could have been, but we don't really know. We weren't there. And so I guess just always be cautious with the people that you fangirl over or fanboy over. Just be really cautious because you don't always know who they really are. And I hope that one day we learn that just because you are famous or a rock star does not mean you get a free pass to do what you want other people as though they are objects. Consent and being of the age to consent is of vital importance regardless of if you are a rock star, a movie star, or a regular old person. That's it. Anyways, I have been very sick recently. I don't really feel that well. It's very late now at this point. It took me forever to film this. I hope that you all learned something. Let me know what you think in a comment down below. Please be respectful to the accusers, to fans, to everyone. Just be respectful down in the comments. You guys normally do a really good job at that, but just as a reminder, please be nice. Don't fight. Be polite, okay? That's all I ask. And if you are new here, if this is somehow your first Marilyn Manson video I've done, there is a playlist I will have down below you can watch with other updates and general information about this case. And if you want to see more from me, and if not already, please do subscribe. I am not sure when I will be doing another Marilyn Manson update just as of yet, but I will try to do one very, very soon here. And yeah, that is basically everything for today, you guys. Thank you so much for your support and watching these videos and everything else. Stay safe out there, and I will talk to you all again soon. Bye!